A reading from the Gospel of John.
Glory to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And the Word was God, and he was with God. And in the beginning, through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing that was made was made. In him was life, and with that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. The Gospel of Christ.
Thanks be to God.
So in 1986, personal computers were just starting to come out onto the market. And at the time, I was living in residence at the University of Toronto, and I was the second person out of our 60 people in that residence to get a personal computer. And so that was the first and last time that I was an early adopter. So I remember that computer. It was an Epson. Epson doesn't make computers anymore. It had 20 megabytes of memory. And I remember thinking, like, why on earth? Who is ever going to use 20 megabytes of memory? Of course, that is just uselessly tiny today, but back then it was huge. Anyway, the computer cost a bundle, $2,000. So I managed to scrape together $1,000. That was the most I could scrape together. So I wrote to my grandparents, and I asked them for a $1,000 loan. And so I received a letter back from them with a check for $1,000. And their letter said, "Dear Chris, no need to pay this back. It is a gift. Use it well. Love, Nanny and Grandpa." What an intriguing thing to say. It is a gift. Use it well. Because we don't usually instruct someone how to use the gift we give them. We give it to them and let them do with it as they wish. But I think this actually provides a helpful framework for my current sermon series, which is humanity created in the image of God. So in this series, I'm talking about 5 qualities or aspects of humanity created in the image of God, that is reflecting or mirroring God's own nature. And so I can easily imagine God saying to us of these qualities, and there could be others, these are just 5 I'm focusing on in this series. But I can easily imagine God saying to us, "These are my gifts to you. Use them well." So last Sunday I looked at the first of these qualities, creativity. And so I looked at Genesis 1:1, and the very first verse of Scripture, very first adjective attached to God in Scripture, and the first verse of Scripture is God created. And so we worship a creative God, and our own creativity reflects that. And so I talked about that last week and talked about how, we called to use these gifts well, but they're so easily abused and not used well. So that was last Sunday. Today I'm discussing another of these gift images, rationality. And this is the idea that human rationality, or our ability to use our brains to reason, to think deeply about things, reflects God's rationality, God's own rationality. So where does this idea come from that human rationality images or mirrors God? And what is rationality on top of it? So the idea initially comes from the scripture reading we just heard, John chapter 1, verse 1. And in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God. The Logos was indeed God. So then we got to ask, what does this word Logos mean? And by tradition, translators use the word to translate. So in the beginning was the Word. That's the tradition, the translation we are familiar with in English, and the equivalent in many other languages as well. But there is general agreement among Bible scholars that John is actually, when he's using that word logos, he's drawing on both Hebrew and Greek traditions, ideas there. And so the word logos does indeed include the sense of word or speech, but it's actually much broader than that. And so by tending to have in our minds only the word for logos, we tend to overlook the breadth of ideas that it includes. And so, for instance, in Hebrew and in Greek, it means not just a word, but a creative word from which creation comes forth. On the Greek side, it includes a sense of order in ultimate reality, in the cosmos, underneath all that exists. And if there's order under all that exists, then there's also rationality that brought about that order. And so the logos is also rationality. And there's hints of that in the Hebrew side, but on the Hebrew side, rationality, or logos rather, is focused on wisdom. The logos as wisdom. And so in the beginning was the creative word, order, rationality, wisdom, all that whole package. And all that whole package was with God, and that whole package actually is God. That is God's own nature. And so creation, unsurprisingly, will reflect God's own nature. In Christian tradition, however, when it comes to discussing the idea of the image of God, Christian tradition has heavily focused on the rationality angle. Okay? The image of God is our rationality. And that's been much the case through Christian history. And the reason for that kind of hyper-focus on our rationality is simply because of the Greek focus on rationality. And so the early church theologians, like just after the New Testament period, but for the first 2 or 3 centuries after the New Testament period, Christian theologians were heavily influenced by their Greek context. And in the Greek context, it was rationality that set us apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. And so it is rationality that makes us distinctive as humans, and therefore it must be rationality that is the quality, the image of God in us. Today, theologians disagree with that. Christian thinkers agree with that hyper-focus on rationality. And that's why in this series we're talking about 5 different aspects of our nature that reflect different aspects of God's nature. Nonetheless, while that overemphasis on rationality has had some problems, we'll see, particularly reducing the beautiful complexity that we are as humanity, nonetheless, it is part of how we are in the image of God. So on the one hand, the church has often overemphasized our rationality to the detriment of our other qualities that God has created us with. But the church has also had an opposite extreme of times, going too far the other way by denigrating or dismissing our rationality as hopelessly broken and fallen, and therefore not to be trusted at all. So we've had these 2 extremes through Christian history. So this morning I'm going to look more closely at rationality as one of the ways in which God has created humanity to be in God's image. And this morning I'm going to comment on 3 angles to this. The first angle we've already seen is on the Jewish side of the wisdom tradition. Now, we often tend to think of wisdom as an Old Testament theme. There's what we call the wisdom literature. That's Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and some other texts. And these are called the wisdom books. But wisdom is actually an important part of the New Testament itself. And we do tend to overlook that. Jesus was, among other things, a wisdom teacher. Just give you a couple of quick examples, though there's lots of examples. So, for instance, Luke 14, where Jesus is talking about calculating the cost of a tower as you're preparing to build it. Verses 28 to 30 in Luke 14. Well, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate, there's our rationality, the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? There's a decision. Do we actually have enough money to complete it? For if you are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. And then Jesus likens this to the decision of faith. This is a wisdom teaching. And it relies on our rationality. Or the parable of the stewards in Matthew 25. So the landlord's stewards, or today we'd say property managers, are charged with figuring out proper care of the landlord's property. Okay, the landlord gives a direction. Here's kind of what I want you to do in general. Now you've got to figure it out. Use your rationality to figure it out. And then Jesus likens this real life example to the responsibilities of discipleship. Again, this is wisdom teaching. And much of Jesus' teaching is wisdom teaching by calling us to use our reasoning capacity to make wise life decisions guided by what we know of godly thinking and decisions. In fact, Scripture describes Jesus as the wisdom of God, the one in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And so working through matters with godly wisdom, following the wisdom of Jesus, wisdom of all of Scripture, is one of our biblical uses of our rational capacities. Let's look at another now. Logos as logisthea. I always have difficulty pronouncing this. We have real Greek speakers here. Someday I'm going to get coaching on how to say this one properly. But the idea is thinking deeply. Okay? Philippians 4:8. Logisthea, about whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, commendable, excellent, or worthy of praise. To think deeply. So this means spending time and effort, pondering, analyzing, understanding deeper patterns and implications and truths, making the effort to think deeply about whatever in the world is true, honorable, just, pure, commendable, excellent, or worthy of praise. Let me just give one example of thinking deeply like this from the world of accounting. I have to confess, I've not used accounting illustrations in my sermons much over the years, but I am this morning. The inventor of double-entry bookkeeping was an Italian mathematician and theologian named Luca Pacioli. Pacioli was a friend and one-time roommate as well of Leonardo da Vinci. So this is the late 1400s. During the economic changes of the Renaissance, and the Renaissance period in Europe innovated a lot in the world of finance. During this period, Pacioli developed what's called double-entry accounting or bookkeeping. And he published the first book teaching this method of accounting. But this invention of double-entry bookkeeping was just not merely about number crunching for him, because it was a consequence of his Christian faith, of his theology, of thinking deeply through his Christian faith and lenses about his profession. Because he saw financial accounting as a moral science. Is that interesting? Seeing accounting as a moral science. Perhaps we need to see all of our professions as moral sciences. Anyways, he saw accounting as the science of financial stewards, there's that word steward that's so common in the New Testament, of financial stewards telling financial truth as fully as possible. And the single entry method of accounting, bookkeeping, wasn't doing this because it was so easily abused or just mistakes made in that method. And so Pacioli thought deeply about the nature of financial recording from a faith perspective and came up with a new system of accounting, the double entry system, that's still being used 500 years later. There are an infinite number of things in the world that are true, honorable, just, pure, commendable, excellent, worthy of praise, including in places we may not expect to see them or to find them. And Scripture calls us to think deeply about these things, about their causes, patterns, interconnections, weaknesses, implications, and possibilities. So that's logizithe. And here I'm coming now to dianoia, the third thing I want to talk about this morning, basically kind of analytical thought. In the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus commands his followers to love God with all your heart, soul, dianoia, and strength. So that heart, soul, and the usual English translation is mind, heart, soul, mind, and strength, combination of words is a translation from Deuteronomy 6:5, but the original Hebrew isn't kind of that precise. The original Hebrew gives a sense of recognizing that to love God with every part of your being. That's basically it. And so what this is saying in the Gospels is love God with every part of your being. The words the Gospels use are heart, soul, mind, and strength. Dianoia and strength. And so dianoia means your rational analytic ability. Love God with all your heart, soul, rational analytic ability, and strength. So it's not surprising that from the earliest days of the Jesus movement, Christians have been engaged in using our rational capacities to understand God, faith, and the world more deeply. Christians have a 2,000-year history of dianoia because the Gospels command us to love God in this way. So I've highlighted these three aspects of rationality pointed to us by the New Testament. Rationality is wisdom, rationality is thinking deeply, and rationality is analytic thought. And those are all intertwined. I'll close with just a couple more comments for this morning, then we'll open up the floor for any conversation, comments, questions, what have you. Rationality involves asking questions. In some Christian traditions, asking questions is discouraged. Asking questions about faith or about the world is taken as a sign of doubt. But I believe this is a mistake because questions can equally be seen as an attempt to think deeply in conformity to what Scripture commands us to do. Parents would worry if their children, as they're growing up, didn't ask questions. Wouldn't we? Not asking questions can often be a sign of developmental delay. And I think the same is true of faith as well. And all of this is the root of an ancient phrase, faith-seeking understanding. This is just an ancient phrase to describe the Christian vocation, task of seeking to understand faith as a faith-building exercise, not a destructive exercise. So, rationality as vocation. Last Sunday I talked about what that means, vocation. I'm going to be talking about all 5 of our different aspects of being in the image of God as vocation given to us, divine calling on us. And in the case of rationality, divine calling to use our brains. To use our rationality to serve others in service of others. And thus to use our rationality with humility. People can so easily have excessive confidence in our rational capacities. Look at how much we've accomplished as humanity. Isn't it incredible? From medicine to space travel. And it is incredible. But as Christians, we are also aware of our frailty as humanity. That in our frail human condition, we misperceive, we make wrong inferences, we draw faulty implications, we omit relevant factors, we have malicious motives. It's all kinds of problems that get into our capacity for rationality. We are just deeply imperfect and subject to sinfulness. And so we abuse our rationality to selfish ends or harmful ends. And so as Christians, Christian faith also reminds us of our need to submit our rationality to God's wisdom, to use it wisely, including to avoid abuse, to intentionally seek to use this gift well, as my grandparents put it, and so to discern and avoid abusive use of our gift for reason. So I could say a whole lot more this morning, but I'm going to draw it to a close there for what I want to say. So let's open up the floor. Stephen has a mic. And if anyone has any thoughts or comments, questions, feel free.
Thanks, Stephen. So I was just wondering, how do we do that today? How do we use our brains, our minds, our rationality to do all of those things? Would that be not following what we hear blindly? Would that be, what would that look like?
Yeah, great question. So just to use that example, not following what we hear blindly, that is excellent. Part of the challenge of living in our modern society is there is so much information coming at us that none of us have the time and capacity to test everything and to use our brains to test everything and do the research to find out if that, that claim is true or that whatever is true. So on the one hand, I think we do need to be intentional about using our brains to assess what we hear, whether it's in social media or news or family or wherever. And that includes, training as well. That includes training in how to use our rationality well. We will not always agree because we're human. But we can do training in using our rationality well. In fact, I know I'm connected with a Christian organization that actually offers a course in because of so much false information in social media in the world today. There are organizations, both Christian and secular, that teach training how to make judgments, assessments on to what extent you can trust or not, certain information. More broadly to your question, Christine, how do we use our rationality in life? I mean, in all areas of life, and I'll just open the floor to any other examples of where that may be. So that's a great question. Stephen.
I have a question, and it would be, I thought it was a useful expansion on the word mind to give it a definition, and the definition based on the Hebrew and the Greek. I wonder if you could return to this sometime later and break down all the words. Love, like basically answer the question more elaborately. How do we love the Lord our God? With our heart. Well, what's the word? Mind. What is that? And then maybe dig back into I'm giving you homework here, but I'm just saying. The Old Testament of those 4 words and the New Testament of those 4 words and how they were transformed and what have you. Maybe it's
That is great.
a sermon series. There you go. There's 8 sermons. You're good. All right.
Series.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Of course, one of my principles in leadership is when somebody makes a suggestion to delegate.
Here's a song about that word. Okay.
Right. So yes, that's a great thought. Appreciate that. Okay, right. So this has been such a controversial area of Christian history. I'm glad to see we've got it down. That is great. So we will leave it there. I will say, and we do have one question at the back, but while we're waiting for...
There's a question from Zoom. Go ahead.
A question from Zoom.
Hi, it's Luke here. It's actually you invited further response to Christine's question about how do we filter through all this information that's thrown at us as part of using our mind to glorify God. And I think another part that's very, using our mindy is being aware of our own biases and our own wants. And as we navigate this information, to check that we're not just trying to hear what our itching ears want to hear. That's commended to us by Scripture, and it's a very analytical thought and reflective thought kind of thing to do.
So, Luke, your signal was fading in and out, but I think what we got is that you're asking about our biases and how to check our biases. Was that correct?
I wasn't asking, I was rather pointing to it as another good use of analytical thought that honors God because God asks us to do it in Scripture as well.
Right. Thank you, Luke. And we're all aware today of language in social media and so forth about society tends to live in silos, not hearing from each other. And that's one way of checking our biases. And also simply with people, we trust as well. But yeah, thank you for that, Luke. Excellent, excellent point. With that, I invite you to stand, and we're going to confess our faith as we affirm the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe